All right, so get ready to dive into something pretty fascinating. The 4B movement. You send us some articles about it, so it's clear you're interested. And to be honest, I am too. It started over in South Korea, but now we're seeing it pop up here in the U.S., especially, after this recent election.
Yeah. And what's really interesting to me is how it kind of taps into these like bigger anxieties people are having about gender roles, relationships, all of that. So we're going to explore all that today, where it started, what kind of impact it's had, and why it seems to be resonating with some women here in the US right now.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess for anyone who's like totally new to all of this, can you kind of just break down like what exactly is this 4B movement?
Yeah. So it's pretty straightforward actually. It's basically four no's. No dating, no sex, no marriage, and no childbirth with men. Like all of those no's are specifically related to men. It's a pretty, pretty strong statement.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. One of the articles mentioned it kind of first popped up in South Korea back in 2017. Why then? Like, what was the situation over there?
Well, if you think back to 2017, that's when the hashtag Me Too movement was really exploding globally. And South Korea was having its own kind of reckoning with that, with a lot of women speaking out about gender-based violence. They have a really significant wage gap over there and just a lot of discrimination. So the 4B movement, kind of grew out of all that frustration. It seemed like this need to make a really drastic kind of change.
So it's like bigger than just individual relationships. It's like pushing back against a whole system.
Yeah, exactly. And it's been, even in South Korea, it's been pretty controversial. The article mentions like some people blame the 4B movement for their declining birth rate, and even their president has criticized it.
Wow. Yeah. So it's like a really like complex situation over there. Why are we hearing about it in the U.S. now, though?
Well, the recent election seems to be, a catalyst. Remember, like Trump's win was driven partly by young male voters, and then there's been some rhetoric, post-election rhetoric about women's rights that's been, well, let's just say unsettling.
Yeah, one of the articles actually like quoted some like pretty shocking social media posts. I mean, no wonder some women are looking for like ways to push back against that.
Yeah, it's important to remember that, the 4B movement is just one reaction, and it's a pretty extreme one. Not everyone agrees with it,
Yeah.
but it does show how real these, anxieties and fears are for a lot of women.
Yeah, well, one of the articles even compared it to like that play, that ancient Greek play, Lysistrata, where the women go on this like sex strike to end a war. I mean, that's a pretty powerful image.
Yeah, it shows that, this whole idea of using relationships as like a form of leverage has been around for centuries. Whether or not it's, actually effective is a whole other debate.
Speaking of impact, like the article talks about like what's actually happened in South Korea since the 4B movement started, like, gaining traction. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's been, a hot topic, as you might imagine. Like even back in 2021, South Korea's president, Yoon Suk Yeol, he actually claimed that feminist movements were actually hurting relationships between men and women.
That's like a pretty bold statement from a leader.
It is.
What else has been said like about the movement's impact?
Well, there's been a lot of debate about, South Korea's birth rate, which has been declining. Some people, point to the 4B movement and they say it's like a contributing factor. But of course, it's a complicated issue with, a lot of factors.
So it's like definitely kind of like shaking things up over there. It's like sparked conversations and controversy too, I imagine. But let's like zoom in on like its emergence in the U.S. More specifically.
Mm.
What details from the article like shed some light on that?
Well, the article points out that like in the 2024 presidential election, a significant portion of Trump's support actually came from young men, like under 30.
That's interesting. That demographic in particular, played such a key role.
Yeah, and the article, doesn't shy away from, the rhetoric around women's rights that we've been seeing, especially after the election. It calls out some pretty disturbing social media posts from some far-right figures.
Yeah, I remember reading about some of those. They were pretty disturbing.
Yeah, like there's a chilling quote from Nick Fuentes, the guy who famously had dinner with Trump at Mar-a-Lago back in 2022. He said something like, "Your body, my choice, forever." And that kind of, sentiment, it's unfortunately been echoed across social media. And that has fueled, a lot of fear and anger, among a lot of women.
Yeah, I can see how that would make women feel like they need to like take a stand.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the article, points out that like since the election, online searches, social media mentions of 4B movement, like it's skyrocketed. So, clearly more and more women in the US are becoming aware of it. And for some, it's really resonating as a potential course of action.
It's almost like the article said, a modern day echo of Lysistrata,
Hmm.
with women kind of using, their power in relationships to try to like force social and political change.
Right, right. It's a concept that's been around for a long time, but its effectiveness is definitely still up for debate. Like, there's even a quote from someone on X who said, "We can't let these men have the last laugh. We need to bite back." And that post got almost 450,000 likes. So that sentiment is really resonating with people.
Yeah. It definitely seems like it's like hitting a nerve for a lot of women in the U.S.
Oh, yeah.
So we've, talked about like the origins of the 4B movement over in South Korea. We've talked about its impacts there. We talked about, this recent surge in interest here in the U.S. But to really understand it, I think we need to look more closely at like the actual societal issues that kind of fueled it over in South Korea.
Yeah, I mean, you can't just look at the movement in isolation.
Right.
To really grasp its significance, we have to understand the context in which it arose.
Right. So let's unpack that. Like, what were like the key issues that led women in South Korea to embrace this movement?
Well, the article paints a pretty stark picture of, the challenges that women are facing over there. It highlights these issues that have really fueled a lot of this frustration and this desire for radical change.
Let's start with gender-based violence, which, seems to be a huge problem over there. What does the CBS article tell us about that?
It's well, the article cites a report from Human Rights Watch, and they use the phrase shockingly widespread when they're describing the levels of gender-based violence in South Korea. It's a pretty disturbing assessment.
That's pretty terrifying to hear. Like, what forms does this violence take, and how are women in South Korea like fighting back against it?
One really troubling form that the article highlights is what they call spy cam porn. Basically, women are being secretly filmed, often in private spaces, and those videos are then, shared without their consent. It's a huge violation.
It's awful. Are there any like efforts being made to stop this?
Women in South Korea have been, really pushing for harsher penalties for anyone involved in creating and distributing spy porn. They're saying that the current laws, just aren't enough. They're demanding, real change to protect themselves from this kind of exploitation.
It's inspiring to see them, standing up against something so awful.
What about like other forms of gender-based violence in South Korea? Well, it's important to remember that gender-based violence, it encompasses a whole spectrum of harmful acts. And the CBS article, points to this broader movement in South Korea where women are really speaking out against a culture that, often tolerates or downplays this kind of violence. They're demanding accountability, not just from individuals, but from institutions that have failed to properly address this, very pervasive problem.
So it's clear that, tackling gender-based violence is like a major factor behind the 4B movement. But the article also mentions some other, really deep-rooted issues too. So let's dig into those as well.
Right. Another one of the key issues that's often cited is the gender wage gap in South Korea. It's a really, glaring example of the systemic inequalities that women continue to face over there.
So tell us, more about that wage gap. The article mentions some like specific numbers that really illustrate the problem.
Yeah. So data from the Korea Times shows that as of 2022, women in South Korea were earning a shocking 31.2% less than men. I mean, that's a massive difference. That puts women at a real disadvantage economically, in almost every aspect of society.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really alarming statistic. It's no surprise that women are demanding change.
Yeah. And, it's not just some like random number. It really reflects this whole system that, undervalues women's work and limits their economic opportunities.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of like those, systemic issues that are kind of driving the 4B movement. But there's another big issue that the CBS article brings up, hiring discrimination and workplace harassment. So can you talk more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is another, huge problem in South Korea. And it, really goes hand in hand with the wage gap. So women face all these obstacles in getting hired for certain positions. They often get passed over for promotions, even when they're, more qualified. And then they have to deal with just a range of, inappropriate behavior at work.
Yeah. That's it's disheartening that this is still happening. It's clear that, women in South Korea have like good reason to be frustrated and to be, looking for solutions like, like the 4B movement. But before we wrap up part one, I kind of want to shift our focus back to the U.S. for a second.
Sure. I think it's crucial to understand, why this movement is resonating here as well.
Yeah. The CBS article brought up some, really alarming statements from like prominent figures in the U.S., regarding women's rights. So can we like revisit those and maybe talk about what their impact might be?
You're talking about the post-election rhetoric that's caused so much, fear and outrage among women.
Yeah.
The article specifically calls out Nick Fuentes, that far-right figure who dined with Trump. His statement, "Your body, my choice, forever." That phrase and others like it that have been circulating on social media, poses a direct threat to women's, bodily autonomy and reproductive rights.
It's a scary reminder, I guess, of how vulnerable women's rights really are and why we need to always be, vigilant. The article also suggests that like the 4B movement could gain more traction here in the U.S. What are your thoughts on that?
It's definitely a possibility. I mean, given everything that's happening, it's understandable that some women in the U.S. might see the 4B movement as, a source of empowerment, or solidarity. But, we need to remember that the movement is, it's complex, and it's not without its controversies.
That's a perfect point to end part one on. In part two, we'll explore, the potential implications of the 4B movement here in the U.S. and we'll look at like the arguments for and against it, and consider other ways to tackle the issues that it raises.
Welcome back to our deep dive into this 4B movement. As we move into part two, it's important to remember that these issues we've been talking about, gender-based violence, the wage gap, hiring discrimination, this alarming rhetoric around women's rights, they're not unique to South Korea. These are global problems, and the U.S. is definitely not immune.
You're absolutely right. In part one, we explored how the 4B movement got started, its impact in South Korea, and we even touched on like its potential to maybe gain traction here in the U.S. So I'm kind of curious to dig deeper into that. Like, what are the arguments for and against adopting the 4B movement, here in the U.S.?
Yeah. Well, that's it's a complicated question and one that's sparking a lot of debate, on both sides. Let's start by looking at the arguments in favor of, the 4B movement's relevance to the U.S., the U.S. context.
Okay, so why might some women in the U.S. like find the 4B movement appealing or, even necessary?
Well, one compelling argument is that, it offers this framework for radical self-care and empowerment, in a society where women often feel marginalized or unsafe. So by rejecting these traditional societal expectations, around dating, marriage, childbirth, supporters say that, women can reclaim their agency and prioritize their own well-being.
That kind of reminds me of that quote from, the person on X who said, we can't let these men have the last laugh. We need to bite back.
Yeah.
So, it's about like taking control, refusing to participate in a system that perpetuates, this inequality.
Right, exactly. The 4B movement, it can be seen as a form of protest, like a way to disrupt the status quo and demand systemic change. By withdrawing from, those traditional relationships with men, supporters believe that they can they can highlight, the essential role that women play in society, and also, kind of expose how men often benefit from women's labor, their emotional support, all of that.
Yeah. It's definitely like a bold statement and one that's bound to generate some strong reactions. But let's not shy away from the counter arguments either. So what are some of the criticisms or concerns that people have raised about the 4B movement, both in South Korea and here in the U.S.?
Well, one of the, most common criticisms is that the 4B movement is just too simplistic, and that it might even be counterproductive. Critics argue that by focusing only on, abstaining from relationships with men, the movement risks alienating potential allies and actually perpetuating, this kind of divisive gender binary.
Right. Yeah. I mean, obviously not all men contribute to these problems.
Yeah.
And many are actively working to, promote gender equality.
Exactly. And there's also, the concern that the 4B movement could lead to further isolation and polarization, between men and women, which could, make it harder to have those productive dialogues, and to actually work together to solve these issues.
Yeah, I think that was a concern in South Korea too, right? Like the article mentioned that President Yoon Suk Yeol actually like criticized, feminist movements for like blocking healthy relationships between men and women.
Yeah, yeah. There's definitely, this sense that, while the 4B movement brings up these really important issues, it might ultimately hinder progress
Yeah.
towards a more equitable society.
So yeah, it's complicated. It's definitely something that deserves some careful consideration.
Hey.
What other criticisms of the 4B movement should we address?
Another big concern is that, the 4B movement, it kind of places this unfair burden on women.
What?
Critics argue that it's essentially asking women to shoulder the responsibility for solving societal problems by making these personal sacrifices, rather than, actually addressing the root causes of gender inequality through, broader systemic change.
Right. That's a fair point. We shouldn't expect women to like, opt out of entire aspects of their lives just to achieve equality. The focus should be on creating a society where, women have those choices freely available to them without, any systemic barriers or pressures.
Exactly. And, critics also point out that the 4B movement's, emphasis on avoiding marriage and childbirth, it could have unintended consequences,
Yeah.
like further marginalizing single mothers or even, reinforcing, those very traditional gender roles that the movement is trying to challenge.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point. It makes you think about like, the impact on different groups of women, and whether it truly offers a path towards greater equality for all women. So,
Mhm.
it's clear that while the 4B movement, raises awareness of these crucial issues, it also presents these complex challenges and potential drawbacks. So I guess, the question is like, what are some alternative approaches to addressing these concerns?
Well, one approach is to, really focus on collective action and systemic change rather than, individual abstinence. So this might involve, pushing for stronger laws and policies to protect women from violence and discrimination, advocating for economic justice and equal pay, and challenging harmful gender stereotypes through, education and awareness campaigns.
Yeah, so it's about shifting the focus from individual sacrifice to collective responsibility and systemic solutions.
Precisely. Another approach is to foster more constructive dialogue and collaboration between men and women. This could mean creating spaces for open and honest conversations about gender, challenging those harmful, masculinity norms, and encouraging men to become active allies in the fight for gender equality.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that, achieving gender equality is a team effort.
Yep.
And it requires challenging, those harmful norms and behaviors and working together to actually create a more just and equitable society.
Yeah, exactly. And there are, so many different ways to contribute to that effort. It could be, supporting organizations that advocate for women's rights. It could be speaking out against sexism and discrimination. It could even just be educating yourself about the issues and having thoughtful conversations with others.
Yeah, those are all great ways to make a difference. So, the 4B movement, it's definitely sparked a really important conversation, but it's just one piece of a much larger puzzle. So before we jump into part three, I kind of want to circle back to South Korea for just a sec. The CBS article mentioned the country's declining birth rate and how some people connect that to the 4B movement. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a complex issue, and like most social trends, there isn't just one cause. So South Korea, like many developed nations, is facing this kind of demographic shift, with an aging population and a declining birth rate. And while some argue that the 4B movement's rejection of marriage and childbirth is playing a role, others point to these broader economic and social factors, like the high cost of raising kids, lack of affordable childcare, and that intense pressure on young people to succeed, in a very competitive society.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we need to look at these issues with nuance,
Right.
right? And
Yeah.
avoid oversimplifying things.
Absolutely. The 4B movement might be a factor,
Yeah.
but it's crucial to consider the broader context and not jump to conclusions or place blame.
That's a great point to transition into part three of our deep dive. So we've explored the arguments for and against the 4B movement, considered alternative approaches, and we've discussed those complexities of South Korea's declining birth rate. So now let's shift our focus to the future. What are like the potential long-term implications of the 4B movement, both in South Korea and here in the U.S., and what broader lessons can we learn from this phenomenon? All right, so welcome back. In this final part of our deep dive into the 4B movement, we're gonna like ahead a little bit. We've explored its roots in South Korea, its potential emergence here in the U.S., and all the complexities that come with it. So what might the future hold for the 4B movement, and what bigger lesson can we kind of take away from all this?
Right. Well, I mean, that's the million-dollar question. And it's tough to say for sure. I mean, the 4B movement is relatively new,
Hmm.
and its future is, still uncertain. But we can certainly look at, current trends and the overall kind of social and political climate to, make some educated guesses.
Yeah, for sure. So let's start with South Korea. Like, what are some possible scenarios for how the 4B movement might evolve there?
Okay. Well, one possibility is that it just continues to gain momentum, attracting more followers, becoming an even more powerful force in South Korean society. And, that could lead to greater awareness of the issues it's raising, which could, in turn, put more pressure on those in power to create more systemic changes to address, gender inequality.
Yeah. I mean, that would be a pretty dramatic shift, wouldn't it?
It definitely would. But of course, on the flip side, the movement could also face a growing backlash, especially from more conservative groups or those who, feel threatened by its challenge to traditional gender roles, and that could lead to attempts to suppress the movement or to discredit it, which could, create even more division and polarization within, South Korean society.
Right. It's kind of a reminder that, social progress, it isn't always, smooth sailing. There are always going to be, people who resist change. And we need to be ready for those challenges.
Absolutely. And, another possibility is that the 4B movement kind of evolves and adapts over time. Maybe it becomes more nuanced in its approach,
Mhm.
or branches out into other forms of activism. Maybe it starts collaborating with other social movements or finding new ways to include men in the conversation about gender equality.
Yeah, that sounds like a more, constructive path, one that, recognizes the complexity of these issues and tries to, build bridges rather than creating more division.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that, social movements, they're dynamic. They're always, evolving. What might start as a very radical stance can, gradually shift and change to meet new challenges and seize new opportunities.
Right. Okay. So let's kind of shift our attention to the U.S. now. Like what might happen here if, if the 4B movement actually gains more traction?
Well, again, it's early, but it's possible that we'll see some of the same, debates and controversies that we're seeing play out in South Korea. There could be this surge in attention on issues like gender inequality, especially around violence against women, the wage gap, and reproductive rights.
Yeah. I mean, that seems to, definitely align with the concerns brought up in that CBS article that,
Yeah.
we talked about.
Right. And we might also see, a rise in alternative relationship models, different lifestyles as more women, choose to prioritize their own well-being and maybe pursue paths outside of, that traditional marriage and motherhood track.
Yeah, that would be like a huge cultural shift, wouldn't it? Like challenging those really deeply ingrained norms and expectations.
It would, but we also have to be prepared for potential backlash and resistance to those changes. We might see pushback from those who feel, threatened by the movement's challenge to traditional gender roles.
Right. Yeah, that's a good reminder that, progress often comes with pushback.
Yeah.
And social change is rarely, a neat and tidy process.
Absolutely. But even amid those challenges, there are some valuable lessons to be learned from the 4B movement. I think one of the most important is the power of women coming together to support and empower one another. This movement has shown that when women unite and speak out, they can force real change.
Yeah.
They can challenge the status quo.
Yeah. And that's a powerful message that I think goes beyond just the specifics of the 4B movement. You know, it's about recognizing those shared experiences that women have and harnessing that collective strength to actually create a more just world for everyone.
Exactly. And another key lesson I think is the importance of just having open and honest discussions about gender, about relationships, about the expectations that we place on ourselves and on others. The 4B movement, it's jumpstarted these conversations. It's challenging us to re-examine those beliefs that we've, long held and to consider different ways of living and relating to each other.
Yeah, it's about, really questioning those norms and expectations
Yeah.
that we often, take for granted and exploring, new possibilities for creating more fulfilling and equitable relationships.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, I think the 4B movement pushes us to think really critically about the kind of world we want to live in. Do we want a world where women are truly valued and respected as equals? Where they have the same opportunities and freedoms as men, or are we going to keep perpetuating the system that often holds them back and treats them unfairly?
Yeah, I mean that's the core question, isn't it? And it's a question that I think each of us needs to grapple with.
Right. And this deep dive has given you a lot to ponder. The 4B movement might be controversial, but it does shine a light on these critical issues around, gender relationships and what the future of our society might look like. So it's really up to each of us to decide how we want to, engage with these questions and what role we want to play in building a more just and equitable world.
That's a great note to end on. So thanks for taking this deep dive with us, and keep those questions swirling.